Hello and welcome to Local Knowledge with me, Jeremy Lander. This is the first of a series of programmes where I'll be looking at features of local interest in Burwell and around Burwell, and hopefully looking into them a bit more deeply, and in between we'll have some nice tunes. We're going to start off by looking at the Catchwater drain. Yes, it's a glamorous title, isn't it? Some people might think of it as just a ditch, but it's a really interesting and very ancient waterway that runs around the west side of the village. It starts out in the fields to the north and runs around until it joins up with the Lode and the weirs that runs from the other side of the village, from the castle. And it's an amazing wildlife corridor. I'm sitting here by the Catchwater drain looking at some lovely ducks going by, and we have swans and their cygnets, lots of fish, kingfishers. There, can you hear the quacking? The ducks are playing around there in the water. And how long has it been here? Well, it's almost certainly medieval, and lots of the villages on the fen edge had them. A lot of them have been filled in, and in fact our Catchwater drain in Burwell was going to be filled in and just put in a pipe back in the 70s. Thank goodness they didn't do that. And what happened was, in medieval times, it was the first thing they did when they were reclaiming the fen close to the village. They wanted to stop the water from draining off the chalk that the village sits on onto their new farmland, and also to catch the water that was coming out of the springs, because we are on a spring line here, and if you go to Burwell Castle you can see the water bubbling out from underneath the chalk there. So we welcome to the show Dr. Susan Westhazen, who is Professor of Medieval Archaeology at the University of Cambridge Institute of Continuing Education, based at Madingley Hall. And her teaching and research focuses on the rights of common and on the development of the English landscape between about 400 and 1300 AD. So the perfect person to talk to. So welcome, Sue. Yeah, so could you talk a little? I was fascinated by your tweets the other day about the Catchwater drain.
Yes.
It really caught my attention, and that's why I thought I'm going to have to talk to Sue about this. Can you say a bit about the drainage of the fens in general and the history of them?
Well, the drainage of the fens doesn't really start proper until about the 17th century as a large-scale movement. Before then, in the Middle Ages, there were local areas where the water was carefully managed to allow to allow the land to be permanently grazed. So there is a little area like that in Burwell to the north of the Lode. And there are other areas, like there's an area in Coveney, and so there are these discrete areas.
Yeah.
But the drainage doesn't begin until much later. And the systems that I was talking about are not about drainage. They're about managing levels of water in the fen.
Oh, that's a different thing, is it? Right.
Which is quite different, yes.
So we have always understood that they wanted to reclaim, if that's the right word, a little bit of land on the other, just the edge of the fen. Yes. And the Catchwater drain was dug fairly early on to literally catch the water that was running off the land, off the chalk, and also to catch the springs, because we're essentially on a spring line, aren't we? So that the fields that they were starting to reclaim weren't inundated with water.
Well, I did this work a few years ago, and I had been walking along the Catchwater in Reach, as well as the Catchwater in Burwell, and it was very noticeable that the droves, the banks essentially, which keep the water in the Catchwater, were so much higher than the land on the other side. So it was clear that the people didn't mind the fen. They didn't want the fen to flood, but they didn't mind if their houses flooded. So there's clearly something important about the fen. But then when I began to dig into it, I realized that the loads, the catchwaters, and the fen ditches were all an integrated system for water management and not for drainage. And the reason is, if you imagine the fen before drainage, before the loads were cut, which of course is a long time before drainage, but before the loads were cut, the water came off the land through the springs and the streams and so on, simply flowed into the fen. And there were a series of little creeks and I've forgotten the word for it, but very bifurcated little streams and creeks that took the water eventually out to the Cam.
Mm.
So the trouble was that when you dug the loads, then you had to, if they're fed by the catchwater, which as you say is catching the water from the springs, all upland water, flowing down across the top of the land, it goes into the catchwaters, and that's what feeds the loads.
Yeah.
So you'd think that would be okay for the land on the other side of those tall banks, which is obviously the fen, and on the, in the area which was susceptible to autumn and winter flooding, and occasionally summer flooding as well. But that land continued to flood because, of course, groundwater flowed underneath the catchwater into the fen. And every time it rained, then the fens would fill up as well. The wetland would fill up as well. So what people had to do then was to dig ditches in the wetlands in order to carry that water into the loads, or if they were sufficiently far west, directly into the Cam. But when one looks at the number of ditches that were dug, they're pretty sparse, and that's the work that's been done at Wicken. And so they're not being dug in order to drain the land. They're there to manage the water levels. And when you read the documentary evidence from, the earliest documents are about 13th century, and the latest are 18th century, where the documents continually complaining that somebody is blocking the river or the loads or the catchwaters or the ditches, so that the farmers can't move the water off the land when they need it to go. So they're happy for the water to come on, but they need it to go after a certain time. And the reason for that, there are a number of reasons for that, but the principal one is that when the air temperature rises above 5 degrees centigrade, the grass underneath the water begins to rot.
Right.
And you've got 3 weeks to get that water off, or you lose all the grazing.
Right. So this is a more sort of natural system, isn't it? It's using gravity and sluices and so on, like sort of you see in third world countries where water is managed in that way.
Yes.
Rather than pumping, which is what drainage needs, doesn't it? To drain something, you've got to pump it, and then you need a windmill, and they're not powerful enough as the land sinks. So it's not until we get sort of industrial steam engines and so on that we're actually talking about drainage of the fen. Is that fair?
Well, that is fair, but on the other hand, it also depends. Excuse me, I've just got a picture here.
It's not going to work on radio, unfortunately, Sue.
No,
but yes, I've got that from the Royal Commission. Yeah, you recommended that was recommended reading on your. You can
see how the loads cut across the natural drainage.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, so maybe we can post that on our website.
When you look at the prehistoric period, the Roman period, the Anglo-Saxon period, the medieval period, and the early medieval period, people were making their money from dairying. There were obviously other ways in which fen products were useful. I mean, the reeds and rushes and the fish and the fowl, all that stuff. But the principal source of wealth for fen edge communities was cattle.
Oh,
and
okay.
So there's this truism that a man who had no land at all, who lived in a fen edge village but had half a dozen cows, was wealthier than an upland guy with 30 acres of land. These people were leaving, and they weren't rich, but they were leaving. They were well off enough to have pieces of pewter, to have large enough houses, and so on. The wealth of the fens before drainage came from cattle. It didn't come from arable cultivation. Arable cultivation, completely different story.
And
Okay, so how old are they?
what period are we talking about? Is this the 1300s, 1400s, that sort of?
The Neolithic starts in 4000 BC.
Oh, from as long ago as that, you think?
And it goes right the way up until drainage begins in the mid-17th century. And then it's patchy because, of course, drainage is variable. So, for example, there are places where, like Rampton, which wasn't drained until the 19th century, effectively, whereas Isleham was drained in the mid-17th. And what you find then is the expropriation of land from the fenmen, and then it's given to these large estate owners who then use it to make a fortune out of arable cultivation. And when you look at the ecology, you look at the plants and the ground cover of Fenland, so it's remarkable how consistent it is across that period. It's nearly 2,000 to nearly 6,000 years.
Well, that's extraordinary. And what happened to sea levels over that period? Did that
sea levels
make a
went up and down. It does make a difference to an extent, because obviously the fen becomes wetter when sea levels are high and drier when sea levels are low. But climate change is a relatively slow process, year on year. And fenmen are used to adapting themselves to changing water levels. So I don't think that the fens were supposed to have been deserted after the Roman period because water levels rose. But it's very difficult to see why that should have happened. And in fact, the archaeological evidence suggests that absolutely was not the case. They continue to be well inhabited.
Yeah. And I suppose cows don't mind standing in a soggy field, do they?
No, they don't.
As long as you say the grass isn't underwater for a long period.
Yes. And
fascinating.
It's a deliberately created system. So how old are the loads? Well, actually, nobody knows. I mean, there's no doubt that the Romans built canals in Finland. Cardyke, of course, is a famous example. And there are others. Canals must have been built continuously in the fens from at least the Roman period onwards in order to manage water, because changing water levels, because they become silted in the way that your catchwaters are becoming silted up, and so on, new needs arise. So when one looks at what happened in the early medieval period, so from the end of the Roman period until the Norman conquest, I think that the evidence suggests there is no doubt that people were building loads, catchwaters, and ditches in that period. And the evidence is that that vast engineering hierarchy was constructed communally. I'm not saying that an individual lord didn't ever do it. No doubt he did.
Yeah.
But by and large, these things were constructed communally, and they were the communality was made up of the people who had a common right, which is a legal right, to feed their cattle in the fen.
And they were certainly used to shifting earth around, weren't they? I mean, you just have to look at Devil's Dyke, which is that sort of period, isn't it? Just post-Roman.
Yes.
A huge undertaking.
Massive, isn't it?
So digging a ditch here and there was not.
No, I mean, but the catchwaters and loads. I mean, those are very substantial earthworks. But nonetheless, they're collectively driven. I don't think there's a lord up there going, go out and dig me a ditch. Yeah. I think this is communities saying, this is what we need in order to maximize our profits from the grazing.
But does that change, Sue, in the 17th century when we get Vermuyden and the adventurers coming along?
Because the land was expropriated, because the commoners lost the land. The commoners had a legal right to that land. And the government simply overrode those legal rights roughshod and expropriated the land and gave it to people like the Earl of Bedford, Duke of Bedford, and he's the one who's the most famous, of course, because he owned so much of the middle level, but there were other landowners as well. And it was just given to them, and the people who had made a decent living in, say, 1640 were reduced to day laboring jobs.
So do you think that, I mean, the Burwell lode, though, is definitely 17th century, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But Burwell Old Load went much further north and joined the Catchwater much further north. Is it called Goose Hall Farm or something like that? Up there.
That went across the Broads, did it? So sort of in that kind of area, I think. I've been looking at the map, Sue. So I've done my homework.
I know.
But yeah, I mean, sort of half a mile up, sort of from the village to the north.
Yes, it's quite a way out of the village.
And then I think it get connected to what's now called the New River, which is this river that
the New Load
we were talking about earlier, which comes. Yeah, but now the load is gone, isn't it? The old load is gone. And can we talk just briefly about the commercial aspect? Because the loads and even the Catchwater drain here, and certainly the weirs, were used for commercial purposes, weren't they? And barges came in with all sorts of produce.
They certainly did. I don't think, I have done a bit of work on this. What was the purpose of the loads and the catchwaters and the ditches? I don't think there's any doubt that the loads, catchwaters and ditches were a system aimed at water management. But they also had, once dug, they also offered opportunities for trade. If the loads had been dug for trade, if that was their primary objective, one would expect to find that the load makes landfall on the catchwater or on the fen edge at the point closest to
where you would commercially expect.
No, the only one that is Reach.
Right.
And the settlement at Reach was deliberately constructed as a medieval market.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, you think of the way that the Hythe extends into the load.
Yeah.
It's a whole peninsula going up Reach Load, but it's additional. It's additional to the construction of the load because there was your Reach Load, so your original Burwell Load right up further north, and then they construct this little Hythe at the end of Hythe Lane, presumably about the same time in the, I don't know, 13th or 15th century, when that little settlement at Newnham first comes into being as a little commercial settlement.
But also, of course, you're getting a big sort of dock, basically a Hythe into the chalk. You don't want to be doing that where the ground is high, do you? So
Burwell was amongst the top ports in England in some medieval date that now I can't remember offhand.
Wow.
1415 or something.
That's amazing.
And of course, Reach was one of the great fairs of medieval England.
Yeah,
Reach,
of course.
St Ives, Ely and Baha and Cambridge.
So how far do you think, I mean, I like to think of bricks and things being brought from Holland and, you know, do you think, is there evidence of produce being brought from and goods being brought from far afield?
Yes. I mean, the bishops of Ely were getting falcons from Norway, and there was Norwegian pine. You know, Madingley Hall has got a turret on the front of the building. It's on the crosswing. Got that turret. If you've ever been in there, it's got a newel post, pine newel post, which goes almost from ground level to the top of the turret. Not quite, but it's a huge one. And that must have come across the North Sea.
Right.
And then they brought wine and oranges and all lovely things from the Mediterranean.
So we've been trading with Europe for a very long time, haven't we?
Yes. And I mean, actually, this is a bit past my period, but I don't know if you know the Merchant's House in Swaffham Bulbeck. That's about in the end of the late 60s or early 70s, when that journalist was still living there. They lifted up a window seat and they found the entire commercial correspondence of the man who had run the Merchant's House between about, I don't know, 1790 and 1805, this little window in time. He was getting corn prices every single week from Amsterdam, from Rotterdam, from Newcastle, and from Liverpool, so that he knew what to offer the farmers in the fens. He imported anything. If whatever you wanted, he'd get it for you. He had a wine cellar for his wine imports. I mean, he imported anything, and anything that you wanted to export, he would find a market for it. And then he had these strings of barges going up to Lynn and then being transferred at Lynn. And you can find that sort of thing happening right through the Middle Ages as well, and no doubt in the early medieval period as well. So I'm not saying they weren't used for trade, they were, but I don't think their primary purpose was for trade. It's a fine distinction.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting, Sue. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Sorry, I talked too much. But...
No, that's perfect. That's really, really good.
So that was Susan Westhuizen, spelt Oosthuizen. I'm saying that because she has a wonderful book called The Anglo-Saxon Fenland, and you probably need the spelling of her name to find it on some well-known internet booksellers, perhaps. Something for your Christmas list. So then I took myself off to Upware on a windy morning in the Fens to talk to a couple of lovely chaps from the Ely Drainage Board, the Swaffham Drainage Board, in fact. And I found myself standing above an amazing thing, the Commissioner's Drain, which is an enormous ditch which stretches off into the distance towards Horningsea and Lode, and basically drains all of that, a massive area of fen, and then it gets pumped up into the Cam. So here is Andrew and Jeremy, and they're going to tell me a bit more about that. So I'm here with Andrew Newton and Jeremy Sadler from the Swaffham Internal Drainage Board, and I'm standing by, would you call it a dike or a ditch?
Well, we call it a drain.
The other way around, a drain.
Yes,
I'm standing
that's one
by
of our main drains.
a drain here in Upware, right by the lock. And this is a drain that is how many metres below sea level, did you say?
It's 2.7 metres below.
2.7 metres below sea level, and it gets pumped up into the Cam, I guess, at this pump house that we're standing next to, that we're going to go in and have a look at in a minute. And we were talking to Sue Westhuizen earlier about the tributary of the River Cam that followed this course, basically. So this, when do you think this was dug? This drain?
1600s. Yeah, this site here we're standing at, this was developed. First pumping station here was 1820s.
Right.
So so there would have been some kind of natural drain, but it's been man-made and dug out over time. And the first time that the board was created was about the 1820s, where the first steam pumping station.
Yeah. That
was used to power to lift the water up into the Cam.
Because I was talking to Sue about this, and before steam engines, it was, I mean, they had windmills, but they weren't really powerful enough to get the water out of the fen, because it had lowered. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's correct. It went on to windmills, but it was found after storms, you often get the calm after the storm. So though all the water was here,
no wind.
There was no wind to pump them, and also they were susceptible to fire as well. So yes, so then they had steam. Steam then went to diesel. Yeah. And then diesel is now turned into electric.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe that's a good point to take to go inside and have a look at the pump. Right. So Andrew and Jeremy just opening up the shed, and here we are looking at an amazing thing painted. Would you say that's Cambridge blue? It's a sort of sky blue. It's a rather beautiful object. And how old is this? Is this the diesel pump?
No. So we're all electric here. So this is
57.
Yeah.
This was.
Right.
Yeah. So this was the first electric pump to replace the diesels that sat on this site. So it's in late 50s and older on what I am.
It must draw a lot of power. You've got some thick cables.
That's one thing we have to have is a lot of power here. It's all electric site. But this, to give you an idea, this will pump 2.1 tonnes of water per second. Wow. And then this is supplemented by 2 submersible pumps that are outside that you won't see, they're underwater, that were put in the 1980s. Yeah. And they pump another 1.5. So this total station has a capacity of 5.1 cumex per second, which is basically 5.1 tons.
But they're not working all the time, presumably.
No,
there's nothing happening at the moment.
No. So now we are in a period where we had wet weather, but the system is starting to respond to that weather. But we tend to do our pumping overnight because we can get the benefit of cheap rate electricity.
Okay. Yeah.
But obviously, if we are in a heavy rainfall system, Jeremy will be out here making sure that pumps are working.
You have to come out in the rain.
Certainly do.
And they could be working 24 hours a day. One thing, a lot of the time the pump is off in the summer because as well as land drainage, we control water levels for abstraction in summer for the farmers to irrigate their crops as well. So we are really water management. So the levels are up in the summer and then down in the winter.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So we're just talking now about the future and the changes in the weather. And Andrew, you were just talking about the changes in rainfall. Perhaps you'd just like to say a bit about that.
Yes, we are definitely finding in summers we're having more periods of intense rainfall. So short storms, but very much a lot of water falling at once, which can make it very difficult to manage the system when we're trying to balance off maintaining high levels for irrigation and also making sure we've got capacity in the system to deal with those storms. And I think this is a trend we're seeing year on year where the pattern we're getting periods of drought in the summer, but then followed up by equally intensive rainfalls. And the winter, Jeremy, is that the rainfall, we're seeing more rainfall over the winter period as well.
So do you have to keep an eye on the weather forecast? And yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Sometimes I don't do it right.
Have we got any big storms in the pipeline?
No, it's just little bits and pieces. But the ground is wet now, and our land drains are running. So whatever falls, even 12 mil makes a big difference to our system. We've got hundreds of metres of land drainage. We're all coming into the system, and 12 mil on top of that, and they're running. It don't take long for the levels to build up. So we have to put more time in the pumps. Or then we switch, if there's a lot of rain, we just go on override and then we just pump to a level which is manageable.
And how far are you pumping up? What level is it's going from here to the cam, I guess. And how is that above sea level?
Yeah, so we're lifting about 4 metres water, so 4 metres difference between the water level in the drain and the river cam. So it's quite a lift.
It's got to lift and pump.
Yes.
And then we find when the rivers are high, we've got to lift and pump, and we've got to go against a big head of water.
So it's harder for the pumps
to work. Harder. The pumps are working harder because it's got to push against the water level, which is high in the river.
Yeah. But as Jeremy says, the Met Office are not always correct. We do follow the weather very closely. But also you can have a period somewhere where you can have 30 mil of rain in one part of the district and it's dry in another. To give you an idea, this district, it's 6,000 hectares and it goes back all the way from here at Upware all the way back up to the A14 near Quay. So it's a big area that we have to look after and manage.
Good. And are you worried about climate change in the future and sea level? I mean, do you think there's a risk that all this will be inundated if there's a sort of problem up at King's Lynn and we get a big flood? I mean, what happened in 1953, for instance? Is there a possibility that we could see a flood like that again?
Well, the last major flood in this area, though 53 was more of a coastal event, was 1947, where we had a lot of breaches in the river systems and the fens flooded. Following that, there was a lot of government investment because there was a need to grow food after the Second World War. New river channels were built. Investment was made in pumping stations and sluices. But them assets are 50 plus years old now. They're coming to the end of their life. The flood banks are coming to the end of their design life. And there is a real risk with climate change that we are going to see an increase in flood risk in this area unless government policy changes. At the moment, it's very difficult to obtain grant funding like we obtained in the 1950s because of the way that the government policies are. So, yes, without major investment, we are going to see an increase in flood risk in the fens in the future.
But are we all right for a few years, do you think?
I think we're all right for a few years, but if we looked at a very short time period, really, next 50 years, we will start to see a dramatic reduction. It's not about just protecting the crops that are out there. There's people people in the fens tend to live on the higher ground, but they travel across roads, rails that could be effective if our pumping stations didn't work. Equally, there's some major important nature sites, conservation areas that we need to protect as well. So I think we need to, going forward in the future, invest in flood risk, but also balancing that to make sure that we are creating habitat.
Because you probably know the National Trust have a long-term plan for creating a kind of wildlife area going all the way from Wicken all the way to Cambridge, don't they?
Yes.
So do you think what we're looking at now, because this is, I mean, I guess what we're looking at is that below sea level? This field out here, it's all below sea level. Can you see in sort of 20 years that this will be more like sort of marshland and won't be farmland anymore?
There potentially could be some areas, and we do work closely with the National Trust. They have, brought land and turned it into, fen. We created the fen again, and as I say, Jeremy, we've worked done projects, haven't we, for the National Trust and managed water levels, because also they need drainage as well as water to recreate the fen. So we do work closely with the National Trust.
Well, we were looking at the Catchwater drain. That's where this programme started. It comes around into New River from Fordham and then across to Wicken.
Yes.
And then I'm guessing it then flows, it sort of branches into two, and then water comes into our Catchwater drain in Burwell and into Burwell Lode.
That's correct. Yeah.
As well as going into
and it comes,
Wicken Fen.
Yeah, and it comes down Wicken Lode. And
Wicken Lode.
Yeah, and then joins back into Burwell Lode. So that's all managed by the Environment, which is the high level system.
Right, that's high level.
Yeah.
But they're all at the same level. So what I don't understand is why the water decides to go one way and not the other.
I think it's just, it's probably so flat that the water has that opportunity just to go both ways.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you very much to both of you, to Andrew and to Jeremy. I don't know if they can run the pump for us. Probably not, because they have to save the... Oh, yeah. OK, let's just hear the noise of the pump. That would be brilliant. OK, we're going to switch the switch.
So at the moment, the outside, the siphon breaker that breaks the siphon that protects stops the river coming back in. It's just blowing the air out. It's just fine.
It's a sunny Sunday morning and I'm here with my lovely assistant Sally, and we're on the search for the source of the Catchwater drain, and we're standing in Exning by the New River, and we're not sure whether we're going to be able to find the source of the river. It comes from the other side of the A14 and it's on private land, but we're going to give it a go. Nice morning. Hi. So we're on a track now by the Exning allotments, and we're heading off towards the A14, and we're just wondering if we can find a bit more of the New River. We just passed some horses, by the way. Lots of horses in Exning. This is as far as we can go, I think, Sally.
Oh,
so
goodness,
yeah.
okay.
So we're standing on the Exning side of the A14, looking down at the New River. Lovely clear water, and has springs all along it. So I think we can call this the source of the New River, Sally, don't you?
Yes,
Yeah.
good enough, eh?